And there's something strangely vulnerable about trying to optimize work that came from your soul. Lately, I've been combing through every part of this podcast, from the titles to the descriptions, hell, even the keywords in the description of the show itself. And there's something strangely vulnerable about trying to optimize work that came from your soul. Because I do want my work to reach people, but I don't want to sterilize my work just to get heard. I want the conversations about healing, sovereignty, witchcraft, and becoming to actually find the people who need them. But the deeper I got into learning about SEO and discoverability, the more I kept running into this uncomfortable reality that most platforms are designed to reward people who can constantly produce and stay visible. And I think one of the most spiritually exhausting things about being online right now is realizing how quickly visibility can start asking you to stop being human, or at least stop being complicated. Because I had all of these plans. I was going to stay consistent with YouTube Shorts. I was going to post more regularly. I was going to finally, quote, do it right. I had researched, planned content ideas, worked on my hooks. I even had different title structures I wanted to test. I started studying what kinds of thumbnails people clicked on, what kinds of phrases held attention longer, what kind of pacing performed better. And at first, it was actually exciting, not only because I love to learn about new things, but because for a long time, I really did feel invisible outside of my day one ride or die listeners. I would spend hours recording and editing episodes that were deeply personal to me and then watch them basically disappear into silence. So when things started improving after I optimized everything, it felt really validating. Like maybe I wasn't failing after all, I just needed to understand the system better. But somewhere in the middle of all of that, the process started changing the way I related to my own work. Because even though I was technically using clips from my real episodes, I could feel myself slowly shifting into a more calculated mindset. So I stopped thinking about moments in terms of emotional depth and instead started thinking, would this hold attention fast enough? Would this perform well enough? Would this make someone stop scrolling? And I don't think I realized how much that was affecting me until my nervous system started reacting to all of it. The filming, the editing, the pressure to constantly create, the watching analytics to see what worked and what didn't, the trying to make cover images that fit what YouTube wants, the trying to think ahead of the algorithm all the time. It wasn't pretty. And I think that made it harder. I think what made it harder was that none of it was technically fake. It's not like I was lying or manufacturing stories. The clips were still me, and the things I was saying were still real. But even so, I could feel the honesty starting to flatten a little under the pressure of performance. Like I was slowly being taught to package my experiences into something more consumable. And after a while, I started feeling this strange pressure whenever I experienced something meaningful. Now there was this little voice asking, could this become content? Would this make a good clip? How do I frame this in a way people will actually click on it? And that really started to bother me because the whole reason I started this podcast was to create a space that felt emotionally honest, not optimized honesty or algorithm friendly vulnerability, real honesty. The kind that takes time and sometimes rambles a little because people ramble when they're telling the truth. The kind that sits inside nuances instead of immediately reducing everything into one emotionally marketable sentence. And I think for a while I kept trying to convince myself that I just needed to find the right balance, that I was missing some secret formula everyone else understood, that eventually I would figure out how to make deeply personal work fit inside systems that rewarded speed and constant output. But instead, burnout hit me like a wall. And with it came the realization that I don't think emotionally honest work can be mass produced in the way algorithms want it to be. At least, not for me and not without consequences. The things I talk about here come from lived experience, the kind that requires sitting with things long enough for them to actually become integrated instead of immediately turned into content. And that kind of work requires recovery space and actual emotional capacity. You cannot keep your nervous system emotionally open 24 hours a day while also trying to feed content machines that reward constant output. Eventually, something starts giving out. And for me, I could feel the joy starting to drain out of my work. And I started to feel pressure about recording, editing, and checking analytics. I could feel myself getting pulled back into the exact kind of performance-based relationship with myself that I've spent years trying to heal from. And the more I sat with that, the more I realized this wasn't actually separate from the things I've been talking about in recent episodes, especially the episode about missing Dipnon, because underneath all of it was the same pattern, the same question. When does devotion become performance? And how quickly do we start tying our worth to consistency? In that episode, I talked about how easy it is to turn spiritual practice into proof of worthiness, how missing one ritual suddenly starts feeling like evidence that you're failing somehow. And I think I started doing the exact same thing with content creation. If I wasn't posting enough, it meant something about me. If the podcast wasn't growing enough, it meant something about me. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it, because content creation didn't create those wounds. It just, once again, gave them somewhere new to attach themselves. The pressure to always be visible, producing, optimizing, and growing can very quickly become another system where your worth starts getting measured through consistency, especially if you already have wounds around productivity, perfectionism, hypervigilance, or proving yourself. And I think that's part of why this hit me so hard emotionally, because what started as me trying to help the podcast reach more people slowly started pulling me back toward the same performance wound, which that's what makes this so complicated. Because social media itself is not inherently evil. I don't think these platforms are intentionally malicious. They are a business that's built to keep people returning, just like every other business. It's a place where visibility gets rewarded through engagement, fast content spreads faster, and constant output gets pushed harder. And honestly, there are creators who thrive in those environments and genuinely enjoy creating that way. I don't judge that, but I am realizing that some forms of work are simply harder to sustain inside those systems without losing something important. And I think trauma-informed work is especially vulnerable to this, because healing is not fast, and trying to compress it into constant, optimized, endlessly consumable content can start creating this strange disconnect where you're technically talking about healing while actively abandoning your own nervous system in the process. And I don't want this podcast to become something I survive instead of something I love. I don't want to lose the honesty that made me start this in the first place. And I certainly don't want to build something meaningful by slowly disconnecting from myself to do it. I don't want every meaningful moment in my life to immediately pass through the filter of, how do I package this? How do I optimize this? Because eventually that starts changing the relationship you have with your own experiences. And I don't think we talk about that enough. The emotional cost of constantly translating yourself into content, the way it can slowly teach you to observe your life from the outside instead of fully living inside of it. The way it can create this low-grade hypervigilance where you never fully relax because part of your brain is always monitoring performance. And for people with trauma histories especially, I think that can become really consuming really quickly, because performance-based worth is already such a deeply ingrained survival pattern for so many of us. So when you place that pattern inside systems that literally reward visibility, productivity, and consistency with numbers and metrics and analytics, it can start hooking into those wounds in ways that are really hard to notice at first, till suddenly your nervous system is spiraling because a video underperformed or you hadn't posted in a few days. And intellectually, you know none of those things define your worth, but emotionally, it can still start feeling like they do. And I think that's what I've really been sitting with lately, because again, I want this podcast to feel lived, like somebody's sitting down and honestly trying to articulate something real, whether that's trauma, whether that's witchcraft, or both. I don't want it to feel like a perfectly optimized content machine engineered to hold attention at all costs. And I'm realizing that in order to do that, I need to change my perspective. Because in order for me to preserve the integrity of what I'm building, it might mean this podcast grows slower. I might disappear sometimes because I need space to recover, and my consistency will look different than creators whose work is built around constant output. That's something I need to start accepting, and that's the point of this episode, to communicate that with all of you, because ultimately, I want to help you guys. But in order to do so, I have to respect my own limits. For me, that means that emotionally honest work requires emotional energy, and that emotional energy is never infinite. I cannot force myself into a state of constant openness without eventually paying for it mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And honestly, I think that's just what happens when the work you create is deeply tied to your nervous system. Because this podcast is not separate from me. It comes from my actual life, my actual healing, my actual reflections, and those things move in cycles. This podcast was never meant to be mass produced. It was meant to be lived first. And again, maybe that changes the timeline. Maybe it changes the pace. It means growth comes slower, but I think it protects the part that matters most, which is the humanity. I hope you guys understand, and I hope I didn't ramble too much through this. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope it resonated with you. If it did, you're welcome to share it with someone who might need this conversation. If it stirred questions, reflections, or even disagreement, you're welcome to join the conversation or suggest future topics on Instagram or YouTube at Salt and Sovereignty, or to reach out via email saltandsovereignty@gmail.com. Until next time, honor the truth that keeps you sovereign.